Wait, there's something very weak coming through.
Popular and charismatic leader. In a speech to the Senate, Palpatine said, quote, "We are an empire ruled by the majority, an empire ruled by a new constitution, an empire of laws, not of politicians, an empire devoted to the preservation of a just society, of a safe and secure society." End quote. That sounds like a good leader to me.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
Hello, fellow Galactic listeners. I'm Aaron Julian, and this is WSTR Galactic Public Access, a Star Wars podcast. Welcome to episode 44. Today, we're going to have a very special debate, the Empire versus the Alliance. Joining the discussion with me today is Mr. Kai Newell.
Hey, everybody.
And he's brought along his friend, Wyatt.
Hello there.
Your last name, Wyatt?
English. Wyatt English.
Wyatt English. Thanks for being on the show. This is going to be a fantastic episode. So, first of all, just Kai and then Wyatt, please let our listeners know who you are and how you got into Star Wars.
Absolutely. So I am currently this is Kai, by the way, a freshman communications major at Moody Bible Institute. I got into Star Wars as a young child, as many individuals do. I started off with the fourth one, and coming from a very homeschool family, my parents wanted to ensure that I knew the Force wasn't real, so lest I fall into heresy or something. I don't know, but that's how I got.
Did they pull the whole Santa Claus routine on you?
They did, yeah.
What?
The full 9 yards.
Wow.
So that's where I come from.
With my brother, my parents didn't even pretend that Santa Claus was the thing. Just right from the get-go. Nope. He's a fairy tale.
Hey, at least you don't have to rip the Band-Aid off at that point.
Yeah, exactly. How about you, Wyatt? Same question.
Sure. So my name is Wyatt English again, and I am a freshman pursuing a communications major here at Moody as well. I got into Star Wars by being a child who was born in the year 1998 in America.
There you go.
Therefore, there was really no opt-out. It was just kind of a mandatory thing. I went down to the basement of my house one day, and my dad showed us the Star Wars movies, my brothers and I, all of us at the same time, and it was quite an experience. I just, that's how you do Star Wars.
Absolutely. So, thank you for cluing us into who you are, how you got into Star Wars, and for all our listeners, you can check us out on social media, anywhere you can find us, all at WSTRmedia, all one word, all lowercase.
And now for our feature presentation.
So Wyatt, we're going to have a debate today. Did the Empire do anything wrong? So why don't you tell us a bit more about what debate is and what to expect for this episode?
Sure thing. So Kai and I are both members of the Moody Debate Society here on campus, and what that means is we participate in an academic-style debate where we actually compete with other colleges around the country. For instance, we traveled to Harvard and Boston, and we will be going to George Washington University in D.C. here shortly. And what we're going to do, Kyle will explain a little bit more about the formatting in a minute, but what we're going to do is have an exchange of ideas where Kai will present the resolution, which is basically the main idea of the debate. And his resolution is going to be something to the effect of, the Empire did nothing wrong. They are the good guys in the Star Wars narrative. He'll explain and clarify later. I wouldn't want to put words in his mouth, at least not yet. And I, as the loyal opposition, or in this case the Rebel Alliance, will be arguing that, in fact, the Empire is not a force for good. Either the Rebels or the Jedi or the Old Republic provided a better moral standard that we should hold to and recognize as good. So Kai will now talk about the formatting, and then we'll get into the round here in a few minutes.
Absolutely. So I have the burden as the first speaker or on the affirmative or government side to kind of lay out the structure of the debate as Wyatt stated. So I'll be, there'll probably be a few words that might not make a whole lot of sense. They'll seem to be kind of technical debate terms, but it'll all kind of make sense as the round progresses. But in regards to structure for the round, we're going to have a series of speeches. We're going to have 4 what's called constructive speeches, and those speeches are all going to be 8 minutes long. It just goes back and forth. I'll talk, Wyatt will talk. I'll talk, Wyatt will talk. In between the first 2, there will be a 3-minute period of cross-examination where Wyatt will get to ask me questions and I will get to ask Wyatt questions. So that will kind of help clarify the round a little bit. And after that, After the constructives are done, we will go to a break where Aaron will cover some Star Wars news, I believe. And then we will go into what's called the rebuttals. In the rebuttals, no new arguments may be brought up. We're just kind of clarifying the round and hopefully communicating to you, the listeners, which side deserves your vote.
All right. And with that, we'll get into the debate proper. So who begins?
I do.
Okay.
All right. So the speech will be 8 minutes. And here we go. From my point of view, the Jedi are evil. This is a quote from none other than Anakin Skywalker in the third episode of the Star Wars saga, Revenge of the Sith. At first, the statement seems ridiculous, but after some careful consideration, we, as the government, or I as the government, have seen its merit. It's for this reason I would like to make the case that the Galactic Empire is morally superior to the Old Republic, the Jedi, and the Rebel Alliance. For this round, we will only be considering the 6 original Star Wars films and the TV show Star Wars: The Clone Wars. The framework we will be using for this round is a utilitarian framework, meaning the arguments that should hold the most weight in this round are the arguments which prove a moral net benefit to the galaxy. With all the legal stuff out of the way, let's get down to brass tacks. Our first reason for believing the Empire was better for the galaxy is that, number 1, the Galactic Empire boosted the economy. They created thousands of jobs with the creation of the 2 Death Stars. They also created thousands of administrative and military jobs, with upward mobility, giving the downtrodden and disenfranchised members of society a chance to rise and make a living for themselves. Stormtroopers were valued members of society with benefits and wages, whereas the Old Republic's clone army was a genetically bred race of self-aware slaves. I will be addressing that point more thoroughly later. The Empire also facilitated free trade by, for the most part, getting out of the way and allowing communities to trade freely with each other. The Empire had significantly less corruption than the Jedi and the Old Republic. While the Old Republic was beholden to the banking clan and various other special interest groups, and the Jedi Knights to their self-righteous elitist agenda, the Empire was self-sufficient and sovereign. Point number 2. The Galactic Empire provided peace and stability to the galaxy. Firstly, the Empire ended the brutal and costly Clone Wars, which lowered taxes on all Empire-controlled planets and freed the citizenry from occupation from both Separatists and Republic troops. The Empire also achieved peace through military strength and technology. Since they were the most powerful entity in the galaxy, they quenched conflict before it could spring forth into more death and destruction. While there is the notable exception of the Rebel Alliance, we view them more as a terrorist cell, not a warring army. A real-life comparison could be drawn between World War II being a representation of the Clone Wars and our current war with ISIS being the war against the rebellion. The Galactic Empire also reduced legislative gridlock. One of the biggest failures of the Old Republic was the ineffectiveness of their Senate. Because there were so many planets represented and so many various interests, it was impossible to respond in such a timely manner to time-sensitive issues. When the Empire centralized power, things were done much more efficiently and with much better quality. Point number 3. The Galactic Empire employed and worked with minorities. When dealing with the enemies of the Empire, such as the Rebellion, the Empire employed bounty hunters of various ethnic and cultural backgrounds, leading to more diversity in the workplace. Notably, the spy on the planet Tatooine, which trailed smuggler and committer of treason Han Solo, was of the Kubaz species. The Empire worked with small business owners such as Jabba the Hutt, which portrayed a willingness to work with all cultures and ethnicities, as opposed to the Jedi, who would only include members with a high midichlorian count, a special substance in a being's DNA. This meant the Jedi were exclusive, an elitist group of criminals not bound by law. They attempted to assassinate an elected official without due process. Our final point is that the Empire was brought about by popular demand. The Rebel Alliance was small. Throughout the films, they were always portrayed as a small, ragtag band of individuals trying to overthrow the government with terrorism. If the cause was that important to the galaxy, why didn't more people join? Was it for a fear of failure? Or was it because the cause wasn't worth the cost? To tie into this point, Chancellor Palpatine was duly elected by the Senate. After he was almost assassinated by Jedi and announced the creation of the new Galactic Empire, the Senate was thrilled and his proposal was received with, quote, thunderous applause, end quote.
He was a popular and charismatic leader. In a speech to the Senate, Palpatine said, quote, "We are an empire ruled by the majority, an empire ruled by a new constitution, an empire of laws, not of politicians, an empire devoted to the preservation of a just society, of a safe and secure society." End quote. That sounds like a good leader to me. As I wrap up this first speech, I would like to clarify that I'm not saying that the Empire did nothing wrong. To say they did everything perfectly right, that's just not reasonable. I mean, there were clearly examples of several atrocities that they committed. However, when looking at it as a whole, the Empire was a morally beneficial organization compared to the other entities we have mentioned, such as the Jedi and the Rebel Alliance. And it's for these reasons that we ask you to take the moral high ground and not underestimate the power of the Empire. Thank you. I am now open for cross-examination. This will be 3 minutes.
Wyatt, 3 minutes to begin your questions. Begins when you do.
Sure thing. So the first thing I'd like to talk about in the cross-examination is the point that you made that the Empire created jobs, and I'd like to ask you what you believe the government's role in job creation is.
I believe that whatever ends up employing people and giving them the ability to bring in income, support for their families, that should be done to the best of our ability.
Okay, thank you very much. And the next question I'd like to ask is, what's the difference between free trade and capitalism and cronyism?
I'm not sure I could make the distinction for you.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question I'd like to ask was kind of dependent on that. How does the Empire promote free trade, and how does it stop cronyism?
I don't know about the stopping cronyism aspect of it, but I know, for example, the prime example here being Jabba the Hutt, as in they just got out of the way. They allowed him to operate autonomously, and he employed plenty of minorities and created a boon to the economy.
Okay. The next question I'd like to ask is about your point concerning corruption being reduced because the Empire was not beholden to special interests such as the banking clan.
Correct.
But if we watch the narrative in the Star Wars movies, we see that the banking clan and the Galactic Civil War was actually a tool used by Palpatine to bring about his rise to power. Mm-hmm. So how is the Empire as a government freed from the influence of special interest if the person behind the banking clan is the one who's now in power?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to answer this question in two parts and create like a little bit of a distinction here. The first thing I'd like to propose is that I'm not justifying how the Empire rose to power. There was clearly corruption and a manipulation going on there behind the scenes. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that in its final form, the Empire is a better moral good in the long run. Secondly, to answer that point, throughout the films, we don't see Emperor Palpatine acting in any way beholden to the banking clans. That's not something that he is under the influence of. He simply operates with autonomy and does whatever he pleases or whatever he feels is best for the galaxy, not what the banking clan desires.
Nice. Okay, last question. You said that, and you quoted Emperor Palpatine here, I believe, in saying that this would be a system of government reliant on laws and not on politicians.
Correct.
Can you point to another totalitarian dictatorship outside of the Empire where we can see an example of nations upholding the rule of law?
Just in general?
Mm-hmm.
A totalitarian dictatorship, you say?
Totalitarian dictatorship.
Totalitarian dictatorship. I don't have no examples spring to mind immediately, but once again, let's consider that that Emperor Palpatine is not a dictator. He was a duly elected representative.
Okay. Well, I think that about wraps up our time for cross-examinations.
That's correct. And so now begins the second constructive speech by Wyatt, I believe.
Yep. So this will also be an 8-minute speech, and I will be presenting ideas opposed. So if we're all ready, I will start my speech now. And I'd like to start by moving down the line and addressing the points that were brought up by Kai in his speech, and then with the time left over, I'll address the cross-examinations and maybe provide some positive material as to why the Empire was in fact not good, but the Jedi Alliance, or the Jedi, the Rebel Alliance, or the Old Republic were better. But those might get put off to the second constructive. Now, the first point that he made was that the economy was boosted by the Empire. And his first subpoint under that was how jobs were created with the construction of the Death Star. But in fact, I would like to point out that his justification of this is that job creation is a role that the government should take on. But in fact, I would like to contest that by saying that the government cannot create wealth, it can only move it around. So any jobs that were provided to people came at the expense of a private sector. People were taxed to support that construction, and that means that money and those jobs could not be employed by the private sector. So really, they didn't create those jobs, they just moved them around and destroyed private industry to do so. The second point he brought up was how they have a large military, and that provides a lot of jobs. It's true that they do have a large military, which, again, takes away from the private sector. But the other thing that's important to consider is large militaries traditionally lead to large deficit spending because it costs a lot of money to facilitate all of the goods and arms that are necessary in military ventures. Also, furnishing the bases is expensive. And lastly, paying the individuals, of course, is a drain on the treasury. The third point that he brought up was how free trade was actually benefited by the empire. But if we look at the Star Wars narrative, we can see that this clearly isn't true because of the predominance of smugglers. Smugglers exist because goods and services were limited and excluded from the market by the empire. And the negative effect of that is we have crime running rampant. We have people engaging not only in the smuggling of goods, but also, as we see with Han Solo moving around Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, we have people that are engaging in human trafficking and alien trafficking outside of the government because the government has made it difficult for political opponents to travel. And that's something that, while that case might be something that you would want to justify because they were just political opponents, human trafficking still existed and the network still existed, which means that it had been done before. And that's not a good thing. The next point was about how there was less corruption, which was better for the economy. But as the affirmative speaker said in his cross-examination, the way that the emperor rose to power was through corruption. And he said that there was a distinction between a dictatorship and a duly elected person. But if we look throughout history here on this world, we can see that that's clearly not always the case. Because, for example, Zambia. After Zambia was freed from imperialism in the 60s, I want to say, they had a hotly contested election where there were two viable parties for... I'm sorry, I don't mean Zambia, I mean Zimbabwe. That's my bad. But they had a hotly contested election where there were two viable parties for the first time. And then after that, the party who actually ended up winning engaged in political warfare to consolidate his power and remove his opponents. Since then, that man has been president for 38 years in Zimbabwe. He was a duly elected president, but he used corruption in his office to consolidate power to a dictatorship. So the idea that somebody is squeaky clean simply because they were elected does not mean that they are free from corruption. The second point he made was how peace and stability were enhanced by the empire. And his first subpoint under there was how the Clone Wars were ended. But again, I'd like to point out how Emperor Palpatine was playing both sides, much like a Middle Eastern power who would be funding terrorism and then also fighting terrorism of a different brand than theirs so that they could move forward on their policy goals but also play up to the West that they were against terrorism. Palpatine was simply playing both sides here for his political gain, which means that he was not actually promoting peace and stability and, in fact, increasing corruption. His second point was how there were peace. They have peace through strength, and the rebels are a minor threat. People don't have the ability to majorly contest dictatorships if they are significantly oppressed. The people in North Korea are not able to maintain a sustained attack or resistance on the oppression that they're facing because their lives are so destitute. The empire has people so significantly oppressed that they are not in a position where they can resist. And that is why the rebellion is so small. And that's why we can see that peace is not actually brought about by the empire. And the third point that he made was how there would be reduced gridlock. But reduced gridlock is not necessarily a thing or a positive thing when it comes at the cost of reduced representation, which is what happens when you consolidate power in the hands of an emperor and then eliminate the functions of the Senate. Kai also made the point that the Jedi attempted to assassinate Palpatine, but there have been instances in history where most of us would agree that attempting to assassinate a dictator, even if it's not something that we personally would have done, we can understand where those people are coming from and we would not unilaterally condemn them. For instance, Bonhoeffer attempting to assassinate Hitler or being involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler is an example of when it may have been acceptable to work against someone who was supposedly duly elected because of the evils that they were perpetrating. And that is the same sort of thing that the Jedi were doing. They believed that the evils Palpatine was perpetrating demanded action, and they attempted to take that action. The third point he brought about was that the Empire employed minorities. And his first two subpoints under there were that they employed bounty hunters and spies. And the ways that I'd like to contest that as being a positive are by saying that by employing minorities as bounty hunters and spies primarily, you are relegating them to the outskirts of society and putting them in a place where people can't really trust minorities because they know that the Empire is using them to move about their shady agenda. And the third point that he brought about was, our subpoint under that was how they worked with small business owners such as Jabba the Hutt who employed minorities. The thing about Jabba the Hutt is that he is not the traditional small business owner. He's not the mom and pop in the corner selling groceries to make a living and provide for their kid going to college. Jabba was someone who engaged in the smuggling that was out of bounds for the average individual and the human trafficking. We've seen him with his dancers and his slave princesses that we agree are being oppressed there. But the thing about Jabba is he has sanction from the government. He's an example of cronyism. Now, this is something that I touched on in the cross-examination, and it's also something that I'd like to bring about or discuss here. The distinction between free trade and cronyism is that free trade, the government has no involvement in business, and in cronyism, the government benefits businesses that they like for political reasons. Jabba helps the Empire and is too powerful for them to contest anyway. And so as a result, he gets licensed to behave in ways that are illegal for other people. This is not something that promotes free trade. And in fact, this is a detriment to society, not only because of his moral character, but also because of the ways that he skirts the system. His fourth point was how Palpatine was popular, and his subpoints there were that the rebels were a small faction. I already talked about how because they were oppressed, they could not muster the strength that a normal military could, but also there have been popular leaders before who are not good. For instance, Kim Jong-un in North Korea is immensely popular. His people worship him even though he oppresses them. So the idea that a man is popular does not mean he's good. Also, this man has access to the Force, which can manipulate other people's minds. So the idea that his election was legitimate is somewhat of a farce because he was in a room with these people who he can control with his mind. So that addressed his points. I'll bring up positive points for why the other side was good in my constructives and later, and then address his other arguments and the rebuttals coming later. But that concludes 8 minutes, so I'm now open to 3 minutes of cross-examination questions.
All right. Go ahead, Kai. You've got 3 minutes whenever you're ready.
Excellent. So you talked about how the having a large military increases the deficit most of the time.
Yes.
Okay. Would you contest the idea that the clones were significantly more expensive because you had to manufacture them?
While the manufacturing of clones might have cost more, we don't have hard numbers, of course. Another point that you made was that the stormtroopers were being paid. So you're offsetting that cost by paying people a wage that you said was good enough to support their families. Okay. I think that's more or less a wash.
In the Clone Wars, we see examples of the Republic going into debt and deficit through their spending. But do you have proof that the Empire went into debt over their spending on troops?
I'm not able to give you hard numbers, of course, because we're talking about Star Wars, and they didn't exactly overlay graphs of GDP in the middle of lightsaber fights.
Something tells me you would have liked that.
I would. But if we look at history, we can see that large militaries necessitate large deficit spending.
Okay. My next question deals with your point about smugglers. Were there smugglers in the Old Republic as well? Was Jabba the Hutt, for instance, still operating under the Old Republic?
Yes, but your point about free trade was more concerned about whether or not the Empire brought it about, and I wanted to point out that there were still smugglers.
Okay, good. Do you have... Oh, looks like I didn't finish writing my question here, so we'll move on to the next one. Classic. So you suggested that the Emperor used mass force manipulation to achieve his election. What reason do you have to believe this?
Well, he manipulated events and individuals to bring about the opportunity to have an election in the Senate. Therefore, it would stand to reason that since he has already shown motive and means to manipulate people to bring about his rise to power, he would therefore use those again for the same.
Can you use specific examples of Emperor Palpatine mind manipulating individuals to do his bidding?
I would say that poor Senator Jar Jar from the planet of Naboo was manipulated by Palpatine. In retrospect, in his later years, I like to think that he saw the error in his ways, but to a greater extent, we can see the examples of the banking clans and Count Dooku being manipulated under Palpatine to bring about his plans.
Okay. All right. That actually wraps up all the questions I have. So that will move me right along into my next speech here.
Okay, you've got 8 minutes for your second constructive speech. It will start whenever you do.
Okay, excellent. I would like to thank Wyatt for bringing up the points that he did. I'm looking forward to a rousing debate round. This is an intriguing topic, of course, and I look forward to diving deep into the arguments. I'd like to dive right into the arguments just to start off with. The first thing he addressed was the idea of the government, or the Galactic Empire rather, boosting the economy. He contested this by saying the government can't create jobs, essentially, and he said that they can only redistribute. He said this as a very general kind of fundamental term, like this is kind of what happens generally, but he did not provide specific examples. This is what I'm talking about. We don't know that the people they employed were employed in the first place. And what I mean by this is Wyatt was arguing that they were taken from the public sector, and so jobs were lost there. But in reality, these people could have very well not been employed in the first place. And so by extension, the government, or the empire rather, was creating jobs for these people. The baseline thing I would like to argue here is that at the end of the day, if these workers were able to bring food home to their families, if they were able to put food on the table, bring money in to support their family, that is the government's job. That is what the government should be doing, and that is what we're looking for here, and that should be the bottom line when it comes to it. Second point I'd like to address here is this idea of smugglers. He touched on it a little bit in his speech. I would like to point out that smugglers were still prevalent in the Old Republic days. Now, you would argue that the Empire didn't do anything to reduce this, but as a matter of fact, the Republic, we see plenty of examples of this too, of the Republic cracking down on small business owners and forcing them into smuggling. As a matter of fact, they were the original ones who forced these small business owners into the trade of smuggling because of their heavy taxes. A prime example of this is Zero the Hutt, actually, a relative of Jabba. And she operated and owned a small business, but because the government didn't like what she was doing, they tracked her down and they put her in prison. So we see a clear example here of the Old Republic overstepping its bounds and forcing people into smuggling. And I would argue that this was actually reduced when the Empire came into power. And I mean, Jabba worked quite openly, and that's under the cronyist point, but I'll get there eventually. He made the point, kind of moving on a little bit here to the second point of the part about, let me see here. Yeah, the Galactic Empire providing peace and stability to the galaxy. He reminded us that the Clone Wars were actually, brought about by Emperor Palpatine. And I would actually contest this. The clones were actually brought about by, I believe it was Master Sifo-Dyas, if I remember correctly.
I believe so.
Okay, yep. Just want to confirm with our resident expert here, who ordered the production of the clones long before any of this was actually brought about. So this is actually the Jedi working behind the scenes here. And this brings about a very important point that I'll be carrying through the round here, that the clones were essentially a race of self-aware slaves that were created for the very point of dying. The stormtroopers, at the very least, had the ability to sign up. They enlisted. They were given upward mobility, chances to, do better for themselves, move up in the ranks, get promoted. But at the end of the day, the clones were simply bred so they could be shoved out, mass-produced, put on the battlefield, and killed. If that isn't a genocide of mass proportions, I don't know what is. A point under this, too, the whole idea that the separatists, they simply wanted to separate from the Old Republic. They felt that they were underrepresented, which is an interesting point considering, that there were more people in the Senate than there are currently under Emperor Palpatine. But yeah, these separatists felt like they wanted, something different. They were oppressed, they were underrepresented, so they decided to move on. And the Republic just wouldn't let them go. And so it was actually the Republic who was on the front end here, attacking the separatists and refusing to let them go. So they brought about this destruction. They wanted this genocide. They were okay with spending millions of dollars credits, to promote this image of unity, and we need the galaxy to fall under our banner because we know what's best, when in all reality, they're driving the economy into the ground. They are slaughtering masses and masses of clones. And moving right along from that point, Wyatt brought up this idea about how the reason why the rebellion was so small was because people were oppressed. Now, he didn't bring up any examples of this, which is a very important thing. Like, sure, you can make the claim, and that's what the movies want you to assume, is that, oh, these groups are so small because these people are so oppressed, and, the boot is on their neck. The boot of the Galactic Empire is on their neck. But we don't see any examples of that, actually. Throughout the entire film series, all we see is the Rebel Alliance causing terrorism among a relatively peaceful society. I'd like to remind you that the Empire ended the Clone Wars, okay? So they ended this destruction, they ended this costly death spiral that the Republic had been set on for a long time, and they brought about peace and stability until the Republic came along and ended millions of lives with the destruction of the Death Star. Hurt the economy in that sense as well. And there are no examples, to wrap up the point here, of the Galactic Empire actually repressing people from joining the Galactic Empire. Last point I'd like to touch on here under this point is this idea of gridlock. And he says that just because there was gridlock, that's okay, because we have reduced under the Empire, we have reduced representation, where most of the power is consolidated. I'd like to point out that the Separatists left because they felt that they were not being represented. If they're in a Senate that currently has all members represented, but they still don't feel represented, and so they leave, that doesn't make a strong case for representation. And so, as a matter of fact, even though these people have a say, quote unquote, it's almost like how we have a say in our presidential elections. You can have more of a say if you go and you act, you do political activism. When it comes down to your vote, you have one vote of the millions of people who are voting in the United States. In all reality, your one vote doesn't make a whole lot of difference. It was the same way in the Galactic Senate. So nothing got done. And when there were pressing issues in regards to the Clone Wars, for example, nothing would ever make progress because there was nothing these hundreds and hundreds of planets could ever agree on. So in the end, they needed more power to the central government, or else they would continue this death spiral that they were on. The last thing I'd like to touch on is this idea of Jabba being a cronyist. And I don't entirely see evidence for this in the films, in the sense of Jabba did not work with the Empire. The Empire left Jabba alone. That's the whole difference here. It's the libertarian argument, essentially, that the government should get out of the way. They should let the job owners do their jobs. They don't need to interfere. And so Jabba was able to work much more openly.
I'm going to have to stop you right there. You're going over time.
All right. Thank you much. That was my last point, so that works.
Okay. Wyatt, you've got 3 minutes to respond with any questions you might have.
Sure thing. I don't have as many questions this time, so I might not use all the time. But the first question that I'd like to ask is, you made the point about Zero the Hutt.
Yep.
And how that Hutt's occupation was shut down and the person was actually taken to prison. Mm-hmm. What was Zero's occupation?
I believe her role was similar to Jabba's.
Could you describe that?
That would be transfer of basic commodities, weapons for people who needed them. So just a dealer, like a port that everything runs through.
Weapons for people who needed them. Could I get an example of some of the people who needed weapons smuggled from a Hutt?
Well, I believe that the Rebel Alliance, as a matter of fact, in the Empire days, needed weapons, and I have no doubt that they acquired some of their weapons from Jabba.
I was asking about Zero. I'm sorry if I didn't specify.
Zero. Okay, yeah, I don't have any specific examples of any of the goods that.
Okay, did the alien trafficking or human trafficking that took place with Jabba the Hutt also take place with Zero?
I don't see any examples of human trafficking.
Okay. The next point I'd like to address was how you talked about the clones being bred for war.
Yes.
But the only reason the clones were put into war, even after they were bred, was because Palpatine used them. Should Palpatine, as the person who would go on to become the Emperor, have used those clones?
That you're getting to some real end benefit versus on the way there, which one's better. And so the answer I would have to that is Palpatine saw that the only way he was going to end the Clone Wars was to work behind the scenes. Because of the massive gridlock that was occurring in the Senate, they wanted this perception to go on, and so they continued the funding of the Clone Wars, and Palpatine wanted to end it.
Okay, but was that good for the clones?
In the long term, yes, because they were stopped being produced and stopped being sent to war.
It was good for the clones to cease existing as a species or race because they stopped being produced?
Not in the sense. The clones that continued to exist were no longer just sent out into war, and the production of them was ceased.
Okay. I would like to ask another question. You made a point about how the Old Republic conducted terrorism. Could you define terrorism and give some examples of that?
The Old Republic conducted terrorism?
Yeah, you said, I believe I could have heard that wrong, but I do believe that you said the Old Republic.
I think I was making a reference to the Rebel Alliance. I'm sorry.
Could you define terrorism?
As a definition? I suppose that's what you're asking. Yeah, sorry. The definition of terrorism that we could kind of work for this round would be sowing pain, destruction, and discord where in a peaceful society of law.
Does the use of the dark side of the Force sow pain or discord?
As a general or in specific examples?
You've got 5 seconds left, yes or no?
It can sometimes be used to those effects, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that ends your questioning period. And I believe, Wyatt, you have your second constructive speech at this time?
Yep, and then we'll do the intermission after that?
After a period of questioning, yes.
Okay, right. Sounds good. Okay, and
so the floor is yours whenever you want it.
Yep, and this will begin the next 8-minute speech. I would like to, and this speech adds some constructive material for why the forces in the Star Wars universe that are not the Empire are actually good. And the reason I'm choosing to do that now is because after the intermission, I will have a rebuttal period. So I'm going to respond to the arguments that Kai's brought up in the next speech. But in this speech, I'm going to primarily be talking about reasons that the Empire was not the good guys, but rather the other forces present were the good guys. The first thing I'd like to talk about is an argument from the economic perspective. Kai made very early on the argument that the construction of the Death Stars were an economic boon. And I'd like to point out, therefore, if the construction of one Death Star was good for the economy, so too must have been the construction of a second Death Star. Mm-hmm. Imagine for me this example. If a man is walking on the street and decides to be a bit of a street hoodlum and pick up a brick and throw it through a window of a bakery, the man that owns the bakery now has to pay to replace the window. The man who has a job making and replacing windows gets paid and also gets to move his product. His economic situation is bettered, and because money changed hands, the government has an opportunity to take their cut from it. Therefore, the economy is too bettered by this destruction. Destruction creates economic growth in this case. So, if anything, while the loss of lives were regrettable, the economic argument should be examined and seen to fall to the side of the rebels because they were the ones who allowed for the most destructive creation of economic goods in the movies that we've seen. The second point that I'd like to talk about was this contention of whether or not representation was effectively achieved in the Old Republic, and if that was a good thing, or if centralized power was a good thing. And in today's society, we all acknowledge that it's important to be represented in your government. Our Constitution in America enshrines the ability for each individual to be represented through the tiered system of federalism, where they can be represented not only locally, but also in their state and federally. Now, we don't have a clear picture from the movies of what the local and planetary representation looked like for the citizens of the galaxy. We can imagine it was probably as rich and varied as the cultures and the civilizations themselves. But the one thing we do have a picture of is the representation of those civilizations in the Galactic Senate. Now, of course, there are going to be people who don't feel as though they're being represented because they're in the minority party. But the thing about politics is it's a swinging pendulum that goes both ways. Right now in America, the Republican Party is in control of the presidency and both houses of the legislature. Several years ago, the Democrats had control of both legislatures and a Democrat president. Things go back and forth. The separatists were uneasy with waiting for the pendulum to swing back their way in the political game, and so they took matters into their own hands at the prompting of Emperor Palpatine. The thing to keep in mind is that they were still represented, they were just in the minority. So of course they didn't have all of their legislative priorities passed. Kai and I have both had the opportunity to work in state legislatures, and we've seen minority parties behave in ways that we would think is not becoming of the representative system that we have. But I think we can both agree that using political minorities as an example of people who are not represented is not really complete, or is rather a little bit disingenuous, because they still represent their constituents. And in fact, the separatists were doing a disservice to their constituents by leaving the legislative body of the Senate, because then they could no longer have their voices heard. The third point I'd like to bring about is we've heard 1 point positive about the rebels, 1 point positive about the Old Republic, and the third point I'd like to bring about is a positive point about the Jedi, and that is how they resisted the forces of evil. Kai brought up the point in cross-examination that terrorism, by definition, is the sowing of destruction and pain. In Star Wars, the dark side of the Force is presented in a way that is very similar to Kai's definition of terrorism. The dark side of the Force preys on people's fear, their feelings of being alone, their feelings of loss and regret, and most basically, their feelings of pain. The dark side and terrorism are two streams of water flowing from the same force. Pardon the pun. But by moving a person who uses the dark side of the Force to the foremanship of society, we are not doing anything to stem terrorism, but rather, by definition, as given by the government team speaker, we are increasing terrorism. We are increasing the opportunity for terrorism to impact people's everyday lives, because the Empire is someone, or the Emperor rather, is someone who exercises that dark power. The fourth point I'd like to bring up is the benefits of the courts in the old system. Now, in the movies, the courts get a bit of a bad rap because they're slow. And in today's society in America, we also will lament how long it takes for the judicial process to work out when there are contentious cases. But the reason the judicial process is slow is not because the people are necessarily inept, but rather because they recognize that doing their job well requires deliberation. Being deliberate is imperative to protecting the basic rights of the people in the court system. The courts enshrined liberties that the citizens of the Galactic Empire would have not been familiar with. The Republic had a system where people could have their cases heard fairly. The Empire did not. Using the courts as a scapegoat because of unpopular decisions or slow-moving bureaucracy is no excuse to get rid of the positive goods that they would have offered society. And the fifth point I'd like to offer is really an extension of this. The last thing I'd like to bring up would be the general loss of liberty that would have been experienced by civilians in the galaxy of Star Wars, because the courts are not the only example of people who lost their freedom. The rebels are simply people who have political disagreements with the Empire, and they aren't building droids and contesting a legislative body. They're being oppressed, which is a little bit different. The status quo for them is not something that allows them to be represented at all. And they hear the stories of their parents of a galaxy when freedom was easily available, and they want to return to a time when that was true. They want a better future for themselves and for their children, and that's why they're fighting. So if we look at the two worlds presented, we see one of collectivism oppressing the individual to the point where no liberty can be enjoyed, and rebellion is necessitated under the Empire. And we see a government with the Old Republic that, while flawed, allows people to be represented and to live their own lives. It's because I believe that we should recognize the value of these systems and the value of the individual that I support the Old Republic. Thank you so much for your time. I'm now open for 3 minutes of cross-examination.
Yep. Kai, you've got 3 minutes. The floor is yours.
All right. I just have a few questions for you here, Wyatt. So I'd like to touch on your first point a little bit here. So you're arguing that the destruction of the 2 Death Stars, that was a good, valuable economic boom for the Empire, correct?
I'm saying that destruction can lead to economic boom, and that your point should rather fall onto our side, recognizing that.
Okay. Are you valuing economic betterment over the millions of lives that were lost in the Death Star?
Nope. I'm simply making the point that, economically speaking, that was a positive. Now, obviously, as I said, the loss of life was regrettable, but it was a military institution that was used to oppress people and blow up a planet. So, this point works only if the Death Stars are rebuilt, correct? As we saw, though, the first Death Star was rebuilt, and the second one, I realize that we're limiting ourselves to only the old canon movies, so I'm going to not allude to any future Death Star-like plot devices.
You would be wise to do so.
All right. I'm going to move right along to the second question I have here, and I'd like to ask you to break the conditioning for a moment. You mentioned that the films portrayed the dark side as very negative, evil, feeding on people's fear and hatred, which is accurate to how the movies portray them. But I would like to ask you this very important question. Were there Jedi generals that fought in the Clone Wars?
Yes.
How many refugees do you think were caused because of the clone and Jedi insurgency onto people's planets?
I'd like to point out again that the Separatists would be the aggressors, but not knowing specifics, I'd say, probably at least a few refugees, like maybe 7 at least.
That's a pretty round number. I like it. So, yeah, that actually ends the questioning I have for that.
Okay, we're going to take a short break here to cover some news items from last week.
And now, the Star Wars News of the Week.
Okay, this week in Star Wars news, StarWars.com posted the following on October 12th. In just 24 hours, the trailer for The Last Jedi was viewed more than 120.1 million times worldwide, making it one of the biggest trailer debuts of all time. It had 29.1 million more views than the film's first teaser, released at Star Wars Celebration last April, and there are 242,000, and counting, Twitter posts surrounding Star Wars The Last Jedi this week. But it's your response to the trailer and eagerness to see Star Wars The Last Jedi that has us feeling most proud. It's difficult to articulate what these view numbers, your online discussions, and your reaction videos, which we watch, mean to us. We are humbled and grateful. Next, Ron Howard is at it again and teases the return of more Star Wars Expanded Universe characters for the Han Solo film. He tweeted, #TagAndBink, with a picture of Ron and 2 gentlemen dressed up in Imperial officer garb. Tag and Bink were the stars of a series of parody comics by Kevin Rubio, the creator of the Star Wars fan film parody Troops, put out by Dark Horse Comics that placed the 2 bumbling comedic characters into the peripheral of the events in the original Star Wars trilogy. Tag and Bink are the latest expanded universe characters to enter the official canon, joining a few others, including fan favorite bad guy Grand Admiral Thrawn, who made his debut on Star Wars Rebels. Rubio's celebration tweet and confirmation tweet from John Kasdan, the co-writer for Han Solo, pretty much sealed the deal. Ron Howard today, the 17th, released the title for the previously untitled Han Solo movie, with an official film wrap. And of course, to nobody's surprise, the title is Solo, a Star Wars story. From GameSpot, again, today on the 17th, Electronic Arts has announced that it is closing the doors of Visceral Games, the studio best known for the Dead Space series. The developer had been working on a new Star Wars game, which will now shift directions and move to a different EA team. Quote, "Our Visceral Studio has been developing an action-adventure title set in the Star Wars universe," said Patrick Soderlund, Executive VP of EA Worldwide Studios, in a post on EA's website. In its current form, it was shaping up to be a story-based linear adventure game. Throughout the development process, we have been testing the game concept with players, listening to the feedback about what and how they want to play, and closely tracking fundamental shifts in the marketplace. It has become clear that to deliver an experience that players will want to come back to and enjoy for a long time to come, we needed to pivot the design. And that concludes this week in Star Wars news. So to return to the debate at hand, we're going to have 2 5-minute periods of rebuttals, I believe they're called. And we are going to begin with Wyatt. So whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, sounds good. So just a little distinction before we start. The difference between rebuttals and constructives is that rebuttals are not allowed to incorporate new arguments. You can use new examples to further illustrate arguments, but you're not allowed to bring up new arguments. And the goal of these is going to be to show you why the other side's arguments were wrong, and then also to provide what we call points of crystallization, basically why we think we should win this debate. So that's what's going to be happening, and I will get started on my 5-minute rebuttal right now by addressing 5 points of contention that were brought about by Kai in his last constructive, and then I'll be asking 3 questions of clarification and crystallization. So the first point that I'd like to address was this idea that Kai talked about, how there was no specific example of people being brought from the private sector into the public sector. And I want to clarify, this is an economic idea that's not saying clone troopers went somewhere, or rather stormtroopers at this point went somewhere, grabbed a person working an office desk job and gave them a laser hammer and a helmet and told them to build the Death Star in space with no training. Rather, what I'm arguing is that because somebody is employed full-time in a construction job, they can, by necessity, not have the ability to be doing another full-time job somewhere else. It's just that there's a reduction in the labor pool, and the job cannot be given to someone else, and a private sector job cannot be filled by that employee. The other point under there was the contention once again that it's the government's role to give people jobs, and that as long as the family or the worker is providing enough for their family, then that's good for society. But again, I'd like to point out that that money only comes from taxation, which means that if they have money to feed their family, that means the empire stole that money from somebody else trying to feed their family. Taxation is effectively wage theft and redistribution. The second point that I'd like to bring up was also brought up in his last constructive. It was this idea that smugglers were in the Old Republic, and he used the example of Zero the Hutt, though he wasn't able to specify what sort of goods or services that person, or rather Hutt, dealt in. I think that it's safe to assume that they did more or less the same thing as the other Hutts that we've seen, especially given the context that we know they trafficked in weapons according to what Kai said. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that they also trafficked in humans and in aliens. But the thing that's also important to consider is if you're supplying violent insurrectionists with guns, that might be a legitimate business, or not. That might not be a legitimate business. Rather, as clarification, I do not support arms dealers supplying terrorists domestically. That was not my intention by supporting that Hutt.
Duly noted.
The third point of contention that I'd like to bring up would be this idea that the clones were bred for war, and that as a result, any actions taken by the Old Republic were not justified. They may have been bred, but it was Palpatine, the Emperor, who chose to use those clones. Had the Republic not been under his leadership, we can only speculate as to what would have happened, but the actions of one man negatively impacting people are exactly why we don't support the Empire. It was only because Palpatine had already so consolidated his power that atrocity was able to take place. And had the Old Republic not been manipulated by Palpatine by this point, they would have been able to resist that, and therefore this could have been stopped. The fourth point that he brought up was that there are no examples of rebels being oppressed But as we already talked about, dictatorships suppress liberty and therefore deal in oppression. If a people doesn't have the ability to determine for themselves how to spend their lives and how they will be ruled, then by definition, they are being oppressed, whether that be politically or through military force, though, as we've already seen, the Empire is not afraid to use either of those things. The fifth point was Kai made the argument that libertarian principles would be supported by the Empire allowing Jabba to operate, but in fact that is the definition of cronyism, only letting occupations and businesses that you agree with politically operate. Were it truly a libertarian regime, as Kai wants you to believe, then all businesses would be legal. There would be no smugglers. It wouldn't be preferred treatment for certain smugglers. And while we might not have had that ideal in the Republic either, the thing that's important to recognize is that the Empire cracked down on individuals to the point where they felt they needed to rebel, not because they were underrepresented in a political body, but rather because they had no recourse for representation. The questions I'd like to ask in closing are, which world is better? We talked about in my last speech the worlds that were painted. So with those in mind, the next question is, whose value should be affirmed? The value of individual liberty or that's brought about by the Jedi and the Republic, or the value of collectivism that the Empire pursues? The third question is, who should win this debate? And the answer is whoever you, the audience, thinks better fulfills or better articulates their objective. So thank you so much for your time. That concludes my 5-minute remarks, and now Kai will have his opportunity to rebut.
Whenever you're ready to begin.
All right, thank you. This has been an excellent debate. We've had great points going back and forth, at least I think so. I'd like to once again thank Wyatt and Aaron for moderating here. It's been a great time. For this closing speech, I got 5 minutes to kind of convince you as the audience why I think you should side with the Empire. And I have 3 main categories that have been going back and forth in the round, and I'd like to address and then ask you to value one thing in the end, one crucial thing. First thing I'd like to address is the economic issue. Now, this argument has clearly gone back and forth multiple times, and I would like to crystallize this once again with the simple statement of that people got jobs. Now, I'm going to elaborate on this more and go more in depth, but that's the baseline here. If people are employed, they are able to feed their families when they otherwise would not be able to, then that is something we ought to value. Now, this idea that the Empire was taxing people, and so these people had money and were able to put food on the table anyway, and so the government is just taking this money from them. We have to consider the wide tax pool that they are pulling from. We're talking about systems and systems of planets here that they are able to tax. So the tax on the individual person is minute. It is very, very, very small. Since we have such a broad pool of people to draw from, to assume that it is very expensive to pay taxes under the Empire is just disingenuous, and I don't think it lines up with what we see in the films. The second point under this economic is this whole idea of just getting out of the way. Now, Wyatt mentioned this idea of cronyism and only aligning with the Empire only aligning with businesses that they agree with politically, but we don't see examples of that in the films. We don't see examples of the government stepping in on businesses at all. All we see is the Empire not interfering with businesses, period. So this idea that they just get out of the way, they allow them to do their thing, and that's what the economic benefit is to the galaxy, and that is something that should be valued, and that was something that was not evident under the Old Republic. The second thing I'd like to touch on is this idea of representation. Should we value representation or more centralized government power? I'd like to make the once again crucial point that the separatists left. Now, this isn't just a small minority of people who left. Yes, it was a minority, but it wasn't just a small handful of systems. This was a large group of systems that pulled away from the Old Republic. And it was for the reason that not only did they feel underrepresented, but that they were actively feeling oppressed by their taxes. We're all familiar with the idea, or just the overall empirical control, or Republic control, this idea that the Old Republic was so involved in their lives, and the majority in the Senate was abusing their power to take advantage of the separatists. that is why they left. And that is why the gridlock and the representation is such a bad thing. Because once again, when we see the Empire, we see no examples of this. We see people cooperating with the Empire. We see the Empire working flawlessly, honestly. I mean, just take, for example, the construction of the 2 Death Stars. That was a massive feat of engineering, of cooperation, of being able to bring people together and create something truly unique in the realm of sciences. And so that's why I think we ought to value the more centralized government as opposed to the more representation in the round, because the representation just clearly wasn't working. Last thing I'd like to talk about is what entity is the moral good? And this is really the crux of the round. Which entity valued life? That is what I want us to be focusing on. Which governing body valued life? Once again, I'd like to bring up this idea of the clone army. The clone army was bred and created originally by a Jedi. It was Master Sifo-Dyas who put in the order to have these clones engineered. Palpatine was the one who ended the Clone Wars. Because of the gridlock within the Senate, he couldn't end the Clone Wars just by saying, hey, let's stop this right now. He had to work his plan out through, by the end, being able to end the production of clones and stop sending them out into the battlefield to die endlessly over and over again. Wyatt talked about this idea of the moral good in the galaxy, that the dark side is bad and the light side is good. And this is not right at all. We see the Jedi generals, if compromising on their stances of truth and goodness and light. And so that we can really argue that the Force is generally a neutral entity. It does not have the just black and white connotations. And not to mention that the Jedis tried to assassinate a sitting representative.
You have to end your 5-minute speech there.
All right, thank you.
But thank you both, Kai and Wyatt, for a wonderful debate.
Thank you.
Things may not be as clear as the movies make them out to be.
That's the idea.
But it's wonderful to have you on the show, and this is definitely going to be a very interesting episode once I edit it and put it out.
Excellent.
Let me just wrap up the show here. Thanks again for listening to another episode of WSTR Podcast. Once again, you can check us out on social media, WSTRmedia, all one word, all lowercase. We want to hear from you, so please comment, tweet, rate us on iTunes, and you can email us at wstrpodcast@gmail.com. You know all the ways to get a hold of us. Next week, we are finally going to review the Inferno Squadron book. Now this is podcasting.